I fixed a homeless man's car. What happened next made us both rich and famous. My name's Jason. I'm 35. And if you asked anybody in this sleepy little town in Ohio to describe me, they'd probably say I'm the guy who never quite got it together. I live in a tiny apartment that hasn't seen new paint since Reagan was president. And trust me, the walls show it. My place is filled with pizza boxes, empty cans of Bud Light, and memories of marriage that ended just like my bank account, completely empty. My wife, Sarah, left a few months ago. Can't say I blame her. She got tired of living paycheck to paycheck, constantly stretching a dollar until it screamed. Honestly, sometimes I feel like money evaporates the moment it hits my wallet. Working as a mechanic in a small-town auto shop doesn't exactly make you rich. I spend my days under the hood of cars belonging to folks who are barely doing better than I am. After work, I usually just crash in front of the TV, watching reruns of sitcoms I've seen way too many times, nursing a beer and hoping tomorrow might somehow be better. The shop I work at isn't glamorous either. The floors are always greasy, the coffee tastes like motor oil, and my boss, Jerry, thinks overtime is just unpaid therapy. Jerry's the kind of guy who wears cowboy boots but has never ridden a horse in his life. He's always bragging about his business empire, which is hilarious because it consists entirely of this tiny garage and a vending machine that steals your quarters half the time. I've got permanent oil stains on my hands, and there's always at least one knuckle that's busted open. But hey, it's work, and around here, that's better than nothing. That particular day started worse than usual. My alarm clock decided to quit on me, probably out of sympathy, so I woke up late and rushed to work without breakfast, not even a sad slice of toast. Then, at the shop, every bolt and screw seemed determined to fight me. I swear, cars are personalities, and that day they all conspired against me. By quitting time, my mood was as grimy as the transmission I'd wrestled with all afternoon. After finally clocking out, I dragged myself into my battered old pickup. My truck is a rusty, beat-up Ford that growls like a grizzly bear whenever I turn the ignition. It's held together by duct tape, a whole lot of prayers, and sheer stubbornness, kind of like me. I headed straight to Walmart because, let's face it, cheap frozen dinners weren't going to buy themselves. I maneuvered to the crowded aisles, avoiding eye contact with overly cheerful people trying to sell me discounted vacuum cleaners or sign me up for credit cards I could never qualify for. Grabbing the cheapest microwave lasagna available, I checked out, silently apologizing to my digestive system in advance. Walking back across the Walmart parking lot, dreaming of nuke pasta and another night on the couch, I noticed an old guy desperately turning the ignition key in a battered, rust-covered van. He looked like he'd seen better days about 20 years ago. I tried ignoring him at first, pretending it wasn't my problem, but something inside wouldn't let me just walk away. Maybe it was because he reminded me of myself, just older, grumpier, and somehow even more down on his luck. So, despite every exhausted muscle protesting, I found myself walking toward him. Up close, the guy looked even worse off than me. His clothes hung off him like they'd given up hope, and his face had the kind of wrinkles that only a lifetime of hard knocks could carve. He introduced himself as Bob, his voice as worn as his jacket. It sounded like he'd gargled gravel for breakfast. Bob told me he lived mostly in his van these days, drifting from one Walmart parking lot to the next, surviving off-dollar menus and Goodwill. His van was a mess. If vehicles could retire, this one would have collected Social Security years ago. It smelled like a bizarre blend of gasoline, old socks, and regret. Normally, I'd say a machine like that was beyond saving, but something about Bob's defeated eyes made me roll up my sleeves anyway. 40 minutes later, with grease smudging my already dirty face, I managed to breathe life back into that ancient heap. The engine sputtered and coughed like a lifelong smoker before finally settling into a reluctant idle. Bob's eyes lit up like Christmas morning, and for a second, I felt like I just handed him the keys to a brand new Cadillac. He even did a little dance, which honestly was hilarious enough to make the whole ordeal worthwhile. He started thanking me over and over, insisting he needed to repay me somehow. I waved him off, telling him it was no big deal, just a small good deed to balance out the endless grind of my existence. Bob shook his head slowly, his expression turning serious, and told me something weird. He said good deeds always have a way of coming back around, especially when you least expect them. Honestly, at the time, I didn't think much of it. Life had taught me not to expect much from anything or anyone. So I just shrugged, shook his hand, and watched him drive off into the fading daylight, the exhaust cloud behind him thick enough to warrant an EPA investigation. As I walked back toward Walmart, my stomach growling louder than my truck, and my mind already drifting back to reality, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this encounter wasn't finished yet. But little did I know just how right that strange old guy named Bob would turn out to be. A few days after the whole Walmart parking lot incident, I was back at the grind, wrestling stubborn lug nuts and dreaming about a life less oily. My days blended together like a sad rerun of the same sitcom, complete with a laugh track from my co-workers' jokes at my expense. Jerry, my boss, was in rare form that day, rambling about expansion plans and promising a raise that everyone knew was about as real as Bigfoot. Truth is, I was just trying to survive until payday. Around lunchtime, while I was munching on a sandwich that tasted suspiciously like the stale air freshener hanging in the lobby, I noticed someone standing awkwardly near the shop entrance. Squinting through the dirt-smeared glass, I realized it was Bob, the homeless guy whose van I had miraculously revived in the Walmart parking lot. Honestly, seeing him again was about as expected as winning the lottery or finding vegetables in Jerry's fridge. Curiosity got the best of me, so I wiped my hands on my jeans, which probably made them dirtier, and stepped outside. Bob looked just as worn out as before, but this time there was something different in his eyes, a determination that seemed oddly out of place on his weary face. Before I could even ask what brought him here, Bob launched into a story that sounded like it belonged in some Hallmark Channel movie, minus the cheesy music. Turns out, Bob hadn't always been a guy drifting aimlessly from one Walmart parking lot to another. Back in the day, he owned a modest auto repair shop, a little family-run place over in Indiana. Life was decent for a while, steady income, loyal customers, and a family he adored. But tragedy hit hard when his wife passed away unexpectedly. Bob's world crumbled faster than an overpriced gas station cookie. He spiraled into depression, and whiskey became his best friend. The shop quickly followed his life down the drain, and before he knew it, everything he had built was gone. Listening to Bob's story, I couldn't help but feel a weird sense of connection. Sure, my problems weren't quite on that scale, but the cycle of disappointment and loss was something I knew well. Bob continued, telling me how after losing everything, he decided to just drift, leaving behind the ghost of his old life. He'd been living on the road ever since, wandering from state to state, surviving day by day. But after seeing me fix his van with nothing but stubbornness and a few rusty tools, something sparked inside him again. He had this crazy idea I might just be the guy who could bring his old garage back from the dead. To say I was skeptical would be like saying Jerry was only slightly delusional. The idea of me running any kind of business seemed about as realistic as expecting my truck to pass an emissions test. Yet Bob persisted, his voice steady and convincing. He described his old shop as if it were some buried treasure, sitting abandoned for over a decade, gathering dust and cobwebs, but potentially filled with opportunities one had long given up dreaming about. He even showed me some faded photos he kept tucked away in his van, the shop looking cozy and well-maintained, filled with classic cars and smiling faces. It was easy to see why Bob had loved it so much, why losing it had broken him completely. He spoke with the kind of quiet passion that can only come from having lost something genuinely precious. It made me think about my own life, how quickly things had fallen apart after Sarah left, and how I'd stopped believing that things could ever really change. But here was Bob, a guy who'd lost more than I ever had, standing in front of me offering something potentially life-changing, if admittedly risky. It felt like one of those defining moments they always talk about in motivational speeches or infomercials, except without the annoying catchphrases or overpriced DVDs. As he finished his story, Bob handed me a folded piece of paper. It was a deed to his old property. It looked worn like him, but there it was, solid proof that he wasn't just spinning another sad tale. He asked me to at least go see the place, maybe just check it out for old time's sake. He joked that if nothing else, it might make me appreciate my current greasy dungeon a little more. I stood there, stunned. My whole adult life had been a series of disappointments and broken promises, And here I was being offered something resembling a second chance by a guy who barely knew me but believed in me anyway. Part of me was screaming to run back inside, bury my head under a hood, and forget this ever happened. But another part, quieter but more persistent, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the break I'd secretly been waiting for all along. As I considered Bob's proposal, I imagined what it might feel like to wake up every morning excited about something. Anything, rather than just existing day to day. Bob noticed my hesitation and joked that the worst-case scenario was I'd have another great story for Jerry's daily lectures on how not to ruin your life. I chuckled, picturing Jerry's face hearing that I considered leaving the shop to become my own boss. He'd probably laugh until he cried, or fire me on the spot just for suggesting it. Jerry was the type of guy who took loyalty seriously, but only if that loyalty was to him and his empire, which consisted mostly of vending machines that always ate my quarters and a coffee pot with coffee strong enough to remove paint. Bob shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing my internal tug-of-war, and tried to reassure me. He promised that even though the place had been abandoned for years, it had good bones, solid walls, and probably fewer mice than my current apartment. That got another laugh from me, because honestly, the mice in my place were practically roommates by now, complete with names and personalities. So, against every instinct I developed from years of disappointment, I finally nodded, agreeing to at least visit Bob's old shop. I couldn't help but feel nervous excitement bubbling up in my gut, though maybe it was just a suspicious sandwich making a comeback. As Bob drove off in his barely functional van, leaving a fresh cloud of smoke behind, I stood in the parking lot, wondering if I'd just made the best decision of my life or the worst. Either way, I knew one thing for sure. My dull, predictable life was about to get a whole lot more interesting. When Bob picked me up after work, I couldn't deny I was nervous. Climbing into his rusty old van, which rattled louder than my stomach after skipping breakfast, felt like stepping into an uncertain future. We hit the road toward Indiana. It wasn't long before the familiar Ohio scenery of cornfields and dilapidated barns faded into even more cornfields and dilapidated barns, but now with Indiana license plates. The van struggled valiantly on the highway, sounding like it was seconds away from self-destructing. Every pothole felt like a near-death experience, and Bob casually joked that if we broke down, I'd just have another opportunity to demonstrate my miracle mechanics skills. It wasn't exactly comforting, but at least he kept the mood light. He shared stories from his travels, mostly involving embarrassing moments at various truck stops and gas stations, tales that made me laugh despite my anxiety about what lay ahead. We stopped at a diner along the way, one of those greasy spoons with faded neon signs promising the best coffee in America, which usually means you'll need a tetanus shot after using the restroom. The waitress, a friendly older woman named Darlene, handed us menus stained with decades of ketchup and coffee spills. I ordered a burger that came with enough grease to lube an engine, and Bob went with meatloaf, because it reminded him of simpler times, he said, though the suspiciously firm texture suggested it might have seen simpler times as well. Hours later, after too many restroom breaks at questionable rest stops and one tense encounter with a raccoon determined to join us inside the van, we finally rolled into a small, sleepy Indiana town. It was one of those places that seemed frozen in time, complete with a diner proudly advertising world's best pie and a gas station that hadn't updated its prices since the Clinton administration. The old garage sat on the outskirts of town, hidden behind a screen of overgrown bushes and trees. It was clear the building hadn't seen a visitor, let alone a paying customer, in years. The sign out front was barely hanging on, with faded letters advertising Bob's Auto Repair, looking more like Beau's Au Repas after losing the battle with weather and neglect. Stepping out of the van, I felt my heart sink a bit. The building wasn't exactly what you'd call inspiring. Its walls were chipped and peeling, windows broken or boarded up, and the roof sagged like it was tired of holding itself up. I could practically hear Jerry's mocking laughter echoing in my head, already ridiculing my crazy idea. Bob sensed my hesitation and quickly led me inside through a door that creaked louder than my joints after a day on the shop floor. The interior was even more overwhelming. Dust and cobwebs covered every surface, like some twisted decoration for the world's saddest Halloween party. Tools lay scattered around, rusted and abandoned, and several old vehicles sat half-covered under tarps, silently waiting for someone to remember they existed. As Bob started removing the covers, I immediately spotted something that made my pulse quicken. Sitting silently in the corner, partially hidden beneath years of dust and debris, was a 1967 Ford Mustang, an absolute classic. Its once bright cherry red paint had faded to a dull maroon, and the tires had long since deflated. But even in its sorry state, it was like finding buried treasure. My fingers itched to get under its hood. Bob chuckled when he saw my reaction, clearly pleased that I'd recognized its value immediately. He explained that back when his shop was still running, he'd planned to restore the Mustang as a project with his son, who had moved away long ago, leaving the car and Bob's dreams forgotten. We continued exploring, discovering even more automotive gems hidden beneath piles of junk, an old Chevy pickup truck, a partially dismantled Camaro, and enough miscellaneous car parts to keep any mechanic busy for months. The more I looked, the more I realized that this place wasn't just a shop. It was a mechanic's version of Disneyland, minus the overpriced souvenirs and screaming kids. As we walked through the rest of the garage, Bob filled in more gaps from his past. He told stories about the regular customers, quirky townsfolk who always seemed to have bizarre car troubles, and late-night pizza parties in the shop with his crew after long shifts. It was easy to see how much Bob had loved this place, how every cracked tile and rusty wrench held a memory. Eventually, we reached the cluttered office, where Bob hesitated, looking embarrassed as he admitted he'd lost most of the original paperwork for the garage years ago. After his wife's passing, dealing with any sort of official business was beyond his capabilities, both emotionally and financially. He'd always thought about selling, but the complicated paperwork and potential costs felt insurmountable. Then came the twist I definitely wasn't expecting. Bob turned to me, a serious yet hopeful look in his tired eyes, and offered me the chance to take over the garage. Not just as an employee, but as a partner. A full 50-50 split. If I could help get the place running again. All he wanted was a chance to see his old dream revived, even if he was no longer the one turning wrenches. My mind immediately jumped between excitement and pure terror. Here I was, a mechanic whose greatest financial achievement was successfully avoiding overdraft fees for 2 months straight, being offered a stake in an actual business. It felt absurd, surreal, and completely impossible all at once. Still, looking around the battered shop, something stirred inside me. Maybe it was seeing that Mustang, a symbol of potential buried beneath years of neglect. Or maybe it was simply the realization that opportunities like this didn't come around often, if ever, in a life like mine. Either way, despite every logical voice in my head screaming about the risks and pitfalls, another part of me whispered louder, what if this actually works? I paced around the shop for a moment, picturing what it could look like if cleaned up, a fresh coat of paint, organized tools, and the smell of coffee brewing in the corner every morning. The vision was surprisingly comforting, even motivating. My doubts didn't disappear, but for once, they didn't overpower me completely. Bob, seeing my hesitation, cracked another joke about how at least I'd finally have a chance to be my own boss, assuming I could tolerate myself, of course. I laughed, realizing he'd hit the nail on the head. Being my own boss meant I'd finally get to blame someone else besides Jerry for my failures. Taking a deep breath, I finally nodded at Bob and agreed to his offer, though the words left my mouth shakier than my truck suspension. It was hard not to wonder if I just signed up for a glorious comeback or a spectacular disaster. But standing there in that dusty, forgotten garage, I knew one thing for certain. My boring, predictable life was officially over, replaced by something far more complicated and strangely exciting. After making the leap and deciding to bring Bob's old garage back to life, my days suddenly got a lot busier. I spent every free hour after work and on weekends elbow deep in grease, rust, and optimism. Honestly, at first, it felt like trying to polish a brick. It didn't look promising, but I kept going because quitting now would have made Jerry's smug predictions come true. The old Mustang became my main project, a stubborn beast that challenged me every step of the way. Each night, I'd turn wrenches until my knuckles were sore, fueled by gas station coffee strong enough to power a tractor and sheer determination not to fail. Slowly, as weeks turned into months, The garage transformed from a forgotten, dusty relic into something resembling an actual workspace. The Mustang itself went from neglected to showroom-ready, a gleaming, powerful machine worthy of admiration. After 3 exhausting months, the Mustang was finally ready. It was a beauty, painted cherry red again, its chrome gleaming brighter than Jerry's head after a fresh shave. Bob and I snapped some pictures and listed the car online, mostly expecting to attract a few tire kickers and lowballers. Instead, the Mustang immediately caught the attention of a serious collector from California, who didn't hesitate before wiring us an astonishing $158,000. Seeing that sum appear in our account felt surreal. It was more money than I'd ever imagined, certainly several times more than my entire annual salary at the old job. Bob and I stared at the screen for a solid 10 minutes, jaws slack, wondering if there had been some kind of mistake. But no, it was real. We had just successfully turned a rust bucket into gold. Word about our little success story spread quickly. Soon, collectors and enthusiasts from around the region started reaching out, requesting restorations on their own vintage American classics. It was like someone had flipped a switch. Suddenly, we weren't just dreamers in a rundown garage. We were the go-to guys for restoring classic cars in the Midwest. With a newfound sense of purpose and an actual bank account balance that didn't make me cringe, we started upgrading the garage itself. We installed new lighting, repainted the walls, replaced broken windows, and even splurged on a coffee machine that didn't produce coffee strong enough to remove paint, though Bob jokingly insisted he missed the old, hazardous brew. Bob himself started changing too. With every completed project, he stood taller, smiled more, and even his sense of humor sharpened. Most notably, he quit drinking, proudly declaring he didn't need alcohol when success tasted so much sweeter. The transformation in Bob alone was worth every late night and greasy pair of coveralls. Eventually, we had so much business that Bob and I decided to hire 2 more mechanics. It felt bizarre interviewing job candidates, especially considering my own less-than-stellar employment history. We hired 2 young guys, Dave and Kenny, who reminded me of myself when I was just starting out, minus the cynicism. They quickly proved themselves, bringing fresh energy and skills to our growing team. Within a year, the garage had become a booming business, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue. Each restored classic we sent back on the road only brought more customers knocking. Our parking lot frequently filled with shiny cars, eager customers, and curious locals, including the town's mayor, who proudly declared our shop a local treasure. We even became regulars at local community events, sponsoring the annual summer car show and making generous donations to the town's school fundraisers. Bob joked that we'd become pillars of society, a terrifying thought considering my history of accidentally setting off smoke alarms while reheating frozen pizza. The real cherry on top, though, was when Jerry, the boss who'd spent years reminding me how replaceable I was, showed up unannounced one afternoon. He stood in our bustling, successful shop, looking like he'd just swallowed a mouthful of motor oil. His wide-eyed disbelief was priceless, and I admit it was deeply satisfying. For once, I didn't have to pretend things were going well. They genuinely were. Jerry awkwardly muttered something about always believing in me, a claim so absurd that Bob nearly spilled his coffee laughing. Jerry wandered around the shop, inspecting every detail as if trying to uncover some hidden flaw or secret to our success. After a long, awkward tour, he grudgingly admitted he was impressed and even muttered something resembling an apology before quietly leaving. Life took a definite turn for the better. My apartment transformed from a depressing bachelor cave filled with empty beer cans and pizza boxes to a slightly less depressing place with actual groceries and a functioning microwave. Small victories. Weekends now included actual downtime, occasionally grilling burgers with Bob and the guys out back, enjoying cold sodas and swapping stories about our latest restoration challenges. It was a life I could finally enjoy rather than just endure. But just as everything seemed perfectly aligned, life threw another curveball. One ordinary evening, while wiping grease off my hands and daydreaming about our next big project, my phone buzzed. Glancing at the screen, I nearly dropped it on the concrete floor. The name staring back at me was Sarah, my ex-wife, who hadn't spoken a single word to me since our divorce. Her message was simple, direct, and utterly unexpected. She wanted to meet up, claiming she'd heard about my success and wanted to catch up. My heart hammered as confusion, curiosity, and caution all wrestled inside me. I stood frozen, staring at the phone, knowing this one message had just made my seemingly stable new life a whole lot more complicated. When Sarah's name flashed across my phone screen, it felt as though a ghost from my past had suddenly reappeared. I hadn't heard from her since our divorce, and her abrupt desire to meet up after learning about my newfound success was suspicious, to say the least. Still, curiosity outweighed caution, and I agreed to see her. We arranged to meet at a trendy little cafe in town, the kind of place where drinks had complicated names and cost way too much. Walking into the cafe, memories flooded back, both good and bad. Seeing Sarah again felt strange, like running into someone from a past life. She looked almost exactly the same, carefully put together and smiling that familiar, practiced smile. The conversation was awkward at first, revolving around generic updates and small talk. But soon enough, Sarah began mentioning my success, the garage, the cars, and especially the money. She hinted that we might give things another shot, casually suggesting that maybe we'd both grown and changed enough to make it work this time. As tempting as the idea briefly sounded, something deep inside told me to be cautious. Sitting there, sipping overpriced coffee, it hit me clearly. Sarah wasn't interested in me, the person who had struggled and eventually triumphed. She was interested in success, the newfound security I represented. Realizing that felt like shedding an old skin. With a polite smile, I declined her suggestion, wishing her well as we parted ways for the last time. Walking out of that cafe, I felt like I'd truly turned a corner in life. I was done chasing validation from people who only saw my worth when it suited their own interests. From that moment forward, I fully embraced my new life, dedicated myself completely to our growing business. Bob and I officially finalized our partnership, making me a full-fledged co-owner of the garage. We celebrated by ordering matching business cards, custom mechanic uniforms embroidered with our logo, and an obnoxiously large sign for the front of the shop. We even upgraded our coffee station to include donuts every Friday, a small detail that delighted both customers and employees. Witnessing Bob's transformation was remarkable. He went from a guy who barely looked up when spoken to a proud and active member of our community. He stopped drinking entirely, found himself a neat little house just around the corner from the shop, and even got himself a dog named Rusty, who quickly became the official garage mascot. Rusty spent most days curled up in the customer lounge, happily greeting every visitor, his charm unmatched by even the shiniest car. The local newspapers quickly picked up our story, portraying it as an inspiring tale of second chances and human kindness. Headlines celebrated how a simple act of helping a stranger had changed our lives dramatically. The community rallied around us, proud to have such a positive story unfolding right in their backyard. The garage continued booming, attracting attention from car collectors nationwide. We expanded, hiring more skilled mechanics, turning the business into a well-oiled machine. Dave and Kenny, our first hires, soon became trusted friends as well as colleagues, their energy and youthful humor infusing the shop with daily laughter and enthusiasm. Business success brought stability to my personal life as well. I moved into a nicer place, a cozy house with an actual yard and more space than I'd ever had before. On weekends, I hosted barbecues, grilling burgers and steaks while Bob proudly showed off tomatoes he'd grown himself. Life had shifted from merely surviving to truly thriving. One memorable afternoon, Jerry, my former boss, showed up at the shop again, but this time with a proposition. Clearly humble from our previous encounter, Jerry nervously suggested that maybe our businesses could form some kind of partnership. He awkwardly floated ideas about cross-promotions, joint events, or maybe even combining resources somehow. Bob, ever the joker, teased Jerry by suggesting he was trying to hitch a ride on our bandwagon of success. Jerry laughed nervously, but the underlying tension was clear. After politely declining Jerry's clumsy attempt at collaboration, Bob and I exchanged amused glances as Jerry shuffled away. The irony was rich. Jerry now needed us far more than we ever needed him. Our shop's growing reputation continued to attract media attention. Newspapers featured our story prominently, painting us as local heroes who turned our fortunes around through sheer hard work and goodwill. It felt good to be recognized, but even better knowing we'd earned it honestly. Bob and I decided it was time to give back to the community. We sponsored local little league teams, funded school projects, and even hosted charity events at the garage. The annual charity car show quickly became a town tradition, drawing people from all over the state. We handed out trophies made from spare car parts, a humorous touch everyone loved. The newfound financial security allowed Bob to fully embrace a normal life. His apartment became a cozy home filled with vintage memorabilia from the cars we'd restored. He took pride in simple things, like mowing his lawn or hosting dinner parties. Seeing Bob rediscover joy in life's ordinary moments was perhaps the most rewarding part of my own success. Just when I thought life couldn't surprise me anymore, my phone rang one evening. Initially, I assumed it was another satisfied customer, or maybe Bob reminded me to lock up properly. Instead, the voice on the other end belonged to a producer from a famous automotive TV show. They'd seen our story online and wanted me to become one of their featured hosts and expert mechanics, specializing in classic car restorations. The salary they offered was staggering, almost too good to be true. Standing in the shop, surrounded by the cars we'd restored and the friends I'd made, I suddenly realized the power of one simple act of kindness. Fixing Bob's van that night at Walmart had set off a chain reaction I could never have predicted. My life had completely changed because I'd chosen to help someone without expecting anything in return. Holding the phone, hearing the producer enthusiastically describe the incredible opportunities ahead, I suddenly realized this wasn't merely an ending. It was just the start of a brand new chapter filled with endless possibilities. I knew deep down that the best days of my life were still ahead, and all of it stemmed from that simple, spontaneous act of kindness.